Okay. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Trustee Cheney?
Here.
Trustee Foster?
Here.
Mayor Newhart?
Here.
Trustee Kalora?
Here.
Trustee McKnight?
Here.
Stephen Gaba via Zoom?
Present, sort of.
Tonight is a work session prior to our regular board meeting, and the topic of discussion is the draft short-term rental code. That draft was actually created by former trustee Bill Lindbergh. It has been somewhat examined and changed, but I think this is really pretty much what we've had, and I don't think much has been edited. So where would you guys like to start? Or and Barry, I know that you had some.
Yeah. Looking for him. I mean, the big question, I guess, is where do we stand and what latitude do we have relative to owner-occupied versus not requiring owner-occupied? I sent you some legal information that I got from Conference of Mayors. So, I mean, I didn't look at it in detail. Could you kind of give us the lay of the land on that?
Yes, I was actually very surprised by it, but I think it's going to be what the law is going forward in regard to short-term rentals. Many municipalities in New York that have short-term rental regulations include a provision for owner occupancy. Obviously, it doesn't have to be year-round, but it has to be your primary residence, or what's called your domicile. There are still many municipalities who have that regulation on their books as far as their short-term rentals go. In 2022, a decision was handed down by the Fifth Circuit, it's federal courts, Court of Appeals, in a case called Hignell Stark, it's a hyphenated name, versus the city of New Orleans. And it was a pretty straightforward case. The city of New Orleans had adopted a short-term rental local law, and after a few years of having it in effect, it was determined that the law, the permission that the city had given to allow short-term rentals was having deleterious effects on the city. A lot of people would come in the short-term rentals and they would not be good neighbors. They'd be loud, they'd leave trash, the parking was a problem, they'd hold big parties and things like that. So the city decided that it was going to revise its short-term rental regulations, and among the revisions was a requirement that if you were going to engage in short-term rentals, it had to be of property that you reside in, at least for part of the year as your main residence. The idea being that people would be more responsible in who they rented to if it was property they resided at. And a challenge was brought to the updated regulations by a number of different people who owned rental properties or wanted to rent property in the city of New Orleans. And they brought a number of different legal challenges, constitutional challenges to the city's regulations. And in regard to the requirement that property be owner occupied, the plaintiffs argued that it violated what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause. Now, there is a clause in the Constitution that says only Congress will regulate interstate commerce. The implication of that is that no state or subdivision of a state, such as a municipality, can undertake to regulate commerce, because that power is given interstate commerce, because that power is given exclusively to Congress. But sometimes a state or municipality will enact a regulation, which although it doesn't purport to regulate interstate commerce, has impacts on the people who live in one state to transact business in another state, usually the state in which the municipality or the state that enacts the regulation is located. And they argued that here, if somebody lived outside of Louisiana and they owned property in New Orleans, and New Orleans being a pretty big city, you can see where that kind of thing might happen, they were precluded from engaging in business, the business of short-term rentals, to the same extent that someone who lived in Louisiana, particularly in the city of New Orleans, was allowed to engage in commerce, in the short-term rental business. So they said the law facially discriminates against interstate commerce because it favors locals, people who reside in New Orleans, over people who reside in other states. And the lower court rejected that argument, and they said there are compelling reasons as to why you might need to do this, and they cited all the reasons that New Orleans had listed in enacting the regulations. But when it went up on appeal, the Fifth Circuit overturned the lower court and struck the city of New Orleans short-term rental law to the extent that it required owner occupancy. They bought into the argument that you're treating people who don't reside in Louisiana and own property in New Orleans differently than people who do reside in Louisiana and own property in New Orleans. And the standard for overcoming a challenge under the Dormant Commerce Clause, which means, it's not a direct regulation of interstate commerce, it just does so indirectly, is a very high one. And the court said, you have a number of reasons as to why you want to do this, we understand that, but there are ways that you could undertake to achieve those goals, less noise, less garbage, better parking, without relying on owner occupancy, that is to say, discrimination of out-of-state people versus in-state people. And because there are other means available to you, you violated constitutional rights of people who are engaged in short-term rentals. In 2023, another case came down. This was also in the Fifth Circuit, but it was a lower court decision. It's Anding versus City of Austin. Was decided August 1, 2023. And it picked up on the Fifth Circuit's arguments in terms of owner occupancy requirements for short-term rentals and followed the case to the left. Overturned the City of Austin's short-term rental regulations, which prohibited renting short-term rentals that weren't owner-occupied. Now, the way that the federal courts work is that every district is got its own prominence in whatever area is devoted to it. We're in the Second Circuit, and there's no guarantee that the Second Circuit is going to follow what the Fifth Circuit does. What the Fifth Circuit decides is not binding on courts in the Second Circuit. However, it is persuasive authority. And if a case came along that challenged owner occupancy in New York, there is a chance, possibly a pretty good chance, that the Second Circuit would follow the Fifth Circuit. The whole matter, if the courts, the different circuits disagree, won't be decided until the matter is decided by the United States Supreme Court. So it's not chiseled in stone that you can't restrict short-term rentals to owner occupancy. But certainly, given the way the wind seems to be blowing, and notwithstanding the fact that a lot of municipalities in New York do have this requirement, my advice would be to steer clear of it and just try to come up with other provisions to avoid, noise and irresponsible landlords. If a case was decided against you, striking it down, it would not be good for the village. And certainly, you want to find out in somebody else's case how the Second Circuit feels about this, not the village of New Orleans.
Steve, I have a question about this. So you said that for the purposes of reducing noise and for sanitation purposes, like that is not, it's not, you know, according to this court, that was not an okay approach. What about the issue of housing and housing provision and taking away housing opportunities?
Well, what the court said, it didn't really get it. It touched on it in the first case, the Pignall Stark case. The city of New Orleans had found, and the court was kind of skeptical of it. They called it anecdotal. They apparently didn't have a housing study or anything to back it up. That short-term rentals were driving up housing prices in the city of New Orleans and preventing locals from being able to find affordable housing. And so that was one of the things that the city had wanted to avoid by enacting the owner occupancy requirement. But the Fifth Circuit said you can think of other ways to do that, to achieve that goal without discriminating against out-of-state renters.
So would an
Owner occupancy requirement.
So would an alternate approach, and this is just me thinking, you know, like just using the logic, would an alternate approach be to restrict short-term rentals except for in accessory dwelling units or in secondary, like apartments within a structure? Like a residential structure? So that's an example of an acceptable thing because that's not affecting interstate commerce. It's specifically like the use.
There's no requirement that you allow short-term rentals at all. If you decide you don't want to allow short-term rentals, you can outlaw them. There's not a problem with that. But if you are going to allow them, you have to do it in an even-handed way. Now, if you want to restrict it to accessory apartments or you know, other more limited dwellings, I don't see a reason why you couldn't do that. You're going to need to articulate how you came up with the distinctions between various types of residential structures. But assuming that you could do that in a rational manner, I don't see why not.
Okay, that's helpful.
Is there, do we have the ability to limit the number of permits we issue? In other words, can we just say there will be no more than 40 permits for short-term rentals issued by the village at any one time?
Well, it would be a very difficult thing to do. You are, you know, precluding a great number of people from using their property for short-term rentals in favor of people who just happen to get permits before them. You know, if you can articulate some reason, and you want to study at least to back you up on this, as to why 40 is the appropriate number, you know, that there's something you're trying to avoid in terms of your available housing or what have you, and 40 is where it's at. It's not 50, it's not 35. I mean, you know, you can always find a range and pick the higher number on it, but you're going to need something in writing, factually based, as to why you came and how you came up with that number in order for it to withstand scrutiny.
Getting back to what Carly was pointing out, so we could proceed in that direction, but then would property owners who have a house and don't have an accessory apartment or the ability to provide one on their premises, would we be subject then to them successfully fighting the law to allow them to, you know, own a house, not occupy it, and rent it out as a full house?
Well, if you had a study that supported that there won't be a substantial impact for renting short-term rentals, that is, accessory apartments or limited spaces, but there would be a substantial impact on the local housing market from allowing it for houses, and you could, you know, you could back that up factually in the report, I think it would withstand a legal challenge. But if you just say, well, you know, houses are more robust in terms of what it is people want to rent, accessory apartments not so much, it just seems to us this is a fair place to split it. I think you have a problem when the homeowner came along and said, wait a minute, you're allowing them to rent out a, you know, 400 square foot accessory apartment, I want to rent out the second floor of my house, which is, 6,500 feet, I don't see that there's any reason I can't if you're allowing them to.
What,
So, yeah.
what if you're not requiring owner occupancy, but that you do require, agent occupancy?
Agent occupancy or agent oversight?
Agent occupancy. Because isn't it the same thing? If you require owner occupancy, then the reason that you're requiring owner occupancy is that there is direct oversight of the property. And so then if you require like an owner's agent to be occupying the site, you're not restricting interstate commerce. They can have an agent that is staying there, but there's an agent of the property owner, that is providing direct oversight of the property. Just like you wouldn't have a hotel that has no agent present on site, or a bed and breakfast that doesn't have employee oversight.
I don't know what agent occupancy would look like. I understand what you're saying, but I mean, I have a house, I wanna, rent it out periodically for people to come for, fall in Warwick Valley, and it's gonna be 3 weeks here, or 2 weeks there, and one long weekend here. Where does my agent living on the property fit in? I don't understand quite how it would work.
We have the way that the policy is currently drafted. It articulates that for most of the village, you have to have an owner occupancy, right? And then for certain parts of the village, for the Main Street, and I can't find the citation, I'm sorry.
You're on it.
The agent, the registered resident agent, has to be within 15 miles of the village. So if the problem is that the owner has to be occupying it, but the intention is that there is oversight of the property and the folks that are there, why wouldn't it be fine to make it agent occupied? And then you have the exact same requirements. It's just not requiring that it's the owner that's there. And you have either, the agent has to be on site, or for this certain part of the village, it's acceptable for them to be within 15 miles.
Again, I think that's very different from requiring owner occupancy. I just don't know how agent occupancy would work. It strikes me as kind of an unusual circumstance to have somebody living in your house and you gotta rent it out to the agent, or the agent stays free.
It's either the owner can be the owner's agent. It's not requiring that somebody other than the owner is there. It's whoever is the agent of the property. Whoever is taking responsibility for the property.
But then they're going to have to create a separate dwelling unit on the property for that agent.
No.
If you're renting out the whole house.
Not if you're the agent. It's just the language. It's just saying that it's someone is taking responsibility for the property on site.
And we're creating a distinction between a single family residence situation and like a multiple residence situation in the downtown area with the apartments. Because that's what the way it's drafted now deals with the downtown apartments.
Yeah, and the way that we define the registered resident agent in the policy draft at present is a representative of the property owner.
Right, and all they're required to do is be within 15 miles of the premises.
For the Main Street area.
Yeah,
But you could say, if we wanted to if you wanted to keep the policy as is, this is me just like following the logic. And the issue is the owner occupancy is an alternate to say, instead of, where is that language that says specifically that the owner has to be?
If you look at 115-2, the last definition is owner occupied. And then if you flip to 115.4 on the next page, you'll see that the application requires a notarized statement that the short-term rental property is owner occupied and the short-term rental property is the owner's primary residence, or it is the owner of a building in the central business zone and lives within 15 miles from the village.
Yeah, so you could just change it to owner or agent occupied.
Owner occupied is gonna be a problem. You really should try to get away from it. I mean, do you have to? No. You could bet New York's gonna decide differently than the Fifth Circuit did. But, well, I don't know if I'd wanna take that chance if I was you.
So Steve,
So owner,
Steve,
agent occupied,
were those cases, any of them in New York? You said Louisiana, what was the other one?
Austin,
No,
Texas.
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 Fifth Circuit's down south.
There's no settled law in New York, is that right?
There is no settled law in New York, and in fact, a lot of municipalities have an owner-occupied requirement. But I'm nervous about it.
So Steve, I look at so New York City, right? Quite the largest, and there are 24 other municipalities in New York State, such as Village Newports, Tuxedo Park, Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow, Rhinebeck, right? Quite a few that all have the owner occupied. They don't have any even carve outs like we have, such as we're considering with a central business district. So it's,
Yep.
I mean, that's a good, take New York City's population alone, that's a good portion of the state that's already has these regulations in place. And add two dozen other towns.
And
They were all drafted before these decisions, though.
yeah.
And
What does that matter when it's drafted?
Because they didn't take into consideration that the courts would find that the Dormant Commerce Clause was violated by owner occupancy. They just haven't caught up with the issue yet. Look, it's also possible New York will disagree with the Fifth Circuit. You know, it could be that the cases come down the other way, but, I mean, again, you know, I don't want that to be decided on Warwick's dime.
So what if, just kind of following this thread, because I feel like I don't have an answer on this yet, so just continuing, so that definition, what if it changed from owner occupied to agent occupied? And then it said, as used in the chapter, the term agent occupied shall mean a residence in which the agent of the record owner maintains his or her domicile, blah, 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 and then we stick with the definition that a registered agent is a representative of the property owner.
Well, I'm not real happy with the use of domicile. You might want to change that to residence.
Well, I mean,
Might live somewhere else, but.
yeah,
That aside, I think you could probably structure an agent, if not being in the building, at least being within a reasonable distance to deal with issues that might come up. The 15-mile thing that we've been talking about, for example. And I think you could probably work that out. I think also, though, that you're trading one problem for another problem. Yes, you're getting rid of the Dormant Commerce Clause objection to owner occupancy, but again, I could see circumstances where somebody owns a house, they want to rent out the house to people who want to come in and, you know, you do a VRBO or Airbnb, whatever you want to call it, and you got this guy or this gal who's living, I guess, all year round, I don't know, part of the year, in the building, and
well, the way the language,
it's doable, it's just kind of an odd setup.
but the way the language is written is that they don't actually have to be there year round. They just have to be there not less than 6 months of the calendar year. That's what that says. So, but that kind of gets us into that owner occupancy territory. I mean, I don't think the intention of this is to preclude people from renting out their house for the weekend or for Apple Fest. It's to mitigate the risk of like taking up housing stock or a significant portion of housing stock, B, creating nuisance situations in neighborhoods, and C, having situations arise in which there is no agent available to help address them, as you know, we would need for a bed and breakfast or a hotel. So, I mean, am I right? Are those the three kind of things that we're trying to mitigate the risk of? Is there
Well,
more?
also, another concern is really safety. You don't want someone who's going to rent out a broom closet, right, that doesn't have proper
Yes,
ventilation and
yeah,
things like
yeah.
that. So
Building
we need
code,
to have
right.
a
Well,
fire
that's all in
inspection.
there.
That's in
Well, right,
there,
that's the
yeah.
other, I think, super important
Yeah.
part of this, to make sure it's safe quarters for people.
I'm having an awful hard time hearing them.
Oh, me? No, I was saying, yeah, where is the mic? Is it?
Seems like full-time owner occupied would be a safer situation than someone 15 miles out.
Yeah, so Steve, can you hear me better now?
I like to hear them.
Okay, great. The point I was making is, just in terms of safety, you want to make sure that the unit being rented is livable, right? And I know there's language in this draft that we have, but my point is, that's a super important part, to make sure it's not unsafe conditions for someone staying there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's taken care of, and I think also the issues of noise and, well, for want of a better term, garbage, are covered pretty well in this law, and if we go through the rest of it, I think you'll see that. But the issue of owner occupancy is kind of a big thing. The underlying idea is that if it's your house, you're not gonna let people come in and trash it. Now, having an agent around is very helpful. It's not quite as good as if, hey, this is my home and I'm not gonna let people just come in. Because people do buy properties and just use them for rentals.
So I have been following what's going on with some of the discussions in the town as well. And I've seen multiple sides of this, right? So on one hand, in my former house in the village, I found out years later that there had been an Airbnb next to me for years. I had no idea. They were respectful. There was no nuisance because it was owner occupied. So the people lived there, right? And there was another part of it they rented out. Great example of if they want to earn some income and, they're being good neighbors. That was a great situation. I'm also aware of, at least there's one problem property I'm aware of in Warwick, that, the people live in the city. They found cheap real estate, cheap according to them, and they host weddings, bachelor parties, and it's just, violation after violation. And it's wreaked havoc on some of those neighbors. And I've talked to several of them, right? So I've seen that as well. And they claim there's an agent locally, but person's not always readily available. They just got around the whole agent thing. So it gives me pause. And Steve, I hear what you're saying. If it's someone and that's their house, right? You're almost relying on that pride of ownership and being a good neighbor, that they're going to discourage any kind of adverse rental opportunities.
Yeah, you either don't want to rent to somebody who's going to come in and, this is the after party from the prom, or this is the rehearsal dinner for the wedding, or what have you. And next thing you know, there's not enough room to park all the cars, and there's loud music, and people in the front yard are walking down the street, open containers. It can be a very bad situation. But if you're in a position where you cannot restrict short-term rentals to owner occupancy, you're going to have to find another way to address that. Some of that could be in the form of, if there are violations, your permit is pulled and you can't get a renewal for a certain amount of time, something along those lines.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to revisit the terms of this local law and make sure that the concerns are addressed through other means.
You could restrict,
That's like I said, unless you want to just go ahead with it and, say everybody else in New York is doing it, we'll worry about New York when they change the law here too.
could you
That's my
restrict it on the basis of limiting the number of guests per bedroom, and then not allow any more than that same number as visitors?
I don't know that you'd want to do it per bedroom unless you tied in a square footage requirement. Because some bedrooms can be quite large, where you can fit 2, 3, 4 people in them, others not so much, they're much smaller.
Okay.
The guests you could restrict, but I don't know that it would be based on bedrooms so much as square footage of the dwelling. You don't want to have more than 17, 24 people in a regular sized house.
But that concept is something that is doable without much of a challenge.
Yeah, if you get a memo from the building department saying, this is what a fire code with limit type of a thing, I think you don't have a real problem.
Well, that's in
That's
here.
hard to enforce. It
That's in the
is, but
draft.
also enforcement of that, I don't know that that would be the main means for us to address the issues that we outlined earlier. I mean, we've addressed the safety issue, but, without having someone that represents the owner on site, that's putting the onus for enforcement. Like, it's not shared anymore, it's on the building department.
I don't want to be a wet blanket on the agent issue. Certainly there's merit in requiring it, but I could easily see situations where an owner designates somebody as the agent and they're just not around, or they're around and they just don't care. If you have a bad owner, they're gonna get a bad agent, and it's gonna be, Carl is my guy, I gotta get in touch with Carl. Carl is nowhere to be found, you know?
But-
Carl's just
But what if, even if the
It may
agent
not
is
be
on
as strong
site,
protection as you think it's gonna.
even if the
Well, if
agent
he
is
only
on
there
site?
6 months a year and he's gone the other 6 months,
But that's how you
Yeah.
have it written now, with the owner
is.
occupied. It's the same, that's exactly how it's written.
yes. But I'm saying owner occupied won't be as good, an agent won't be as good as the owner occupancy.
Did you speak to Wade Beltramo?
I spoke to Wade.
Yeah.
Well, I got this as part of the, I guess it was the annual meeting.
Right.
And spoke to him there, and then I reached out to him and got the decisions and passed those along to Steve, and that's what he has basically read and summarized for us.
And did Wade have concern about owner occupancy?
Yes.
Yeah.
The same concern that, I mean, he's read the law, and he's read the decisions, and
Who's
as a
this?
result,
Wade
Okay.
Beltramo,
Conference of Mayors
town
attorney.
council.
So,
This is a very recent development as far as these holdings of the courts. If you Google and go online and try to find owner occupancy requirements, short-term rentals, you're not gonna find articles being written up saying this is a problem, this is something that needs to be addressed. It's just kind of still trickling through the courts. Could it be a big issue 2 years from now? Sure. 3, 5, maybe, as far as that goes. Maybe it doesn't get to New York, in our lifetimes, who knows?
would it,
But we're aware of it, and it's something I think you should take into consideration in drafting this law.
would it be useful for us to spend a couple minutes, or maybe even have like the assignment to contemplate other ways that we could achieve the same goals? Those 4 goals? I mean, we have,
Let's repeat those goals.
yeah, because I actually only have the 3. So we've got the safety and building code situation, which is addressed by another mechanism already in the code. Then we have the noise nuisance garbage situation. And obviously the code, parking, stuff like that. So the code, our code already is already written in such a way, but it's not protective of making sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen. So we have established that there's a need to provide an extra layer of protection when it comes to short-term rentals because of a history of issues in the town. So that's objective number 2. And then the third one is having an agent on site to support, to oversee, to ensure there's not issues similar to the way things would go with a bed and breakfast or a hotel.
Okay, hold on a second. So with these goals, I see you're getting at with the agent to ensure.
Or maybe we
there aren't
just
issues,
say
but
we
I don't
have
think it has to do with the
support.
agent. I think it more has to do with
You're right.
encouraging good neighborly behavior by having someone who has a vested interest in that property and their.
Or
their
that
community.
there's someone that can actually address issues that like on site if something arises.
To go there if
To
somebody.
go there.
Actively
Yeah.
engage
'Cause-
during rentals. Okay.
Yeah, I know I'm being a broken record, but like a hotel, they don't have unoccupied hotels. Like there's somebody at the front desk, you
Right.
know? So why would a short-term rental be different? When there's
I
even
see where you're
fewer
coming from, Carly.
controls.
An agent is certainly a great thing to have around a tree falls and breaks the fence, or a baseball gets knocked through a window, or a door lock breaks, or what have you, I don't know that an agent is going to go in and say, you have too many people in this building, you're parking illegally on the street, hey, you didn't pick up the garbage from yesterday. They might be helpful, but I don't think that's gonna be something that they're gonna be strong in policing.
Right, but I'm not talking about the agent right now. I'm just talking about the goal of having support in case there are issues, which is protective both for the people that are visiting and then also for, you know, the village and nearby folks.
And housing inventory, wasn't that one of the things we wanted to?
That was the
consider?
fourth issue, yeah,
Sure.
housing inventory.
But the short-term rental industry, the housing issue is substantially a result of poor planning, rather than the fact that some of that rental property is soaked up by Airbnb. We didn't create that situation. Governments that haven't built, or villages or towns that haven't taken the properties available and turned them into moderate income housing, however it was put, mid-income, mid-range housing. You know, where's that? And that's, we didn't create that. May I read this? Because I know we're gonna run out of time. I'll make it-
Well, this is a work session of the board,
Yeah.
and if you'd like at the end,
Yeah,
you can read that
okay,
letter.
that's fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
So those four,
Yeah, and I just have a question. If we're differentiating central business district, what about the properties that are owned by restaurants and businesses? Is that in the same category, or is that a different category?
Steve, did you hear that?
Yeah, I'm looking at the law, just give me a second.
I think the intent was any downtown area building that has apartment rentals in it could apply to become a renter, a short-term renter.
But what if it's not an apartment per se, but just an area that is just specifically Airbnb?
Well, it would have to be an apartment.
Okay.
The code allows rental of any single residential living space which is capable of housing one separate household,
Okay.
whether it's attached single-family structure or building or part of a multi-household structure or building, but not including a hotel, motel, or bed and breakfast establishment. So for a hotel, motel, bed and breakfast, then this law doesn't apply to you, but the housing units, even apartments above commercial uses, would be subject to rental for Airbnbs, but it's gotta be an apartment, it's gotta have kitchen space, bathroom, etc.
All right.
is it possible that this is a zoning issue? Like, how is it that we can't allow, we don't have like bed and breakfasts and hotels in every zone, but we can have short-term rentals in like every
And
residential
hotel
zone?
and motel type taxes are much higher than those paid by Airbnb, which
Well,
is
that's
4%.
the other issue.
So
It's like
that's
14 or so percent, 15% versus like 4%.
New York City's higher, I think, than.
And bed and breakfasts, I believe, are allowed in residential zones.
okay, maybe that's something
And
to
we
look
pay
at.
taxes to Orange County.
But also, Steve, in terms of an apartment, I believe that the state restricts, it could only be no more than 2 apartments in the dwelling to allow for a short-term rental. So if it was a,
Multiple dwellings are a different animal, if that's what you're asking for. I don't think that short-term rentals are allowed for apartments in a multiple dwelling.
That's
Okay.
correct. New York State says that. That's my research. It's
Because otherwise you have all these strange people coming in and out, it really creates a safety problem.
yeah.
I mean, potentially at least.
No condos, duplex, or multi-apartment complex.
If we take a step back, just hopefully to give you perspective on this, and I know you guys are all up on this, so just bear with me, I'll be brief. So you're not, as I said, required to allow short-term rentals at all. If you don't want to have short-term rentals, you can say no short-term rentals. But in Warwick, there's a desire for short-term rentals. People want to come in and they want to stay for fall weekends or spring or what have you. And it's going to lead you to consider, should we allow short-term rentals? And if you decide that you do want to allow short-term rentals, that's when we get into all the bells and whistles on this law. What are the terms and conditions under which you're going to allow short-term rentals? Now, you've identified 4 concerns that you have that you want the law to address. Some of them are already addressed, others may need tweaking. But I think that's pretty much where you are. If you start from square one, are we going to allow these? It's square two, under what terms are we going to allow these? You decide what your goals are, then you can really focus on what the provisions of the law should be to make sure that your concerns are addressed and the things you want to achieve are achieved. You may not achieve them all together. I know there was some mention of, zoning being an issue, and gee, we should do other things to, make sure that our housing stock, at least in terms of affordable housing, is or moderately priced housing is improved, and that's true. But that's not a reason not to, go forward with what you can do on the short-term rentals here. So I got to tell you, I just found out about the, thanks to Barry, the issue of the owner occupancy issue. I am, if the board's inclined to let me do it, perfectly happy to rework the law. I can come with some proposed language to address Carly's proposal as far as having an agent either occupying it or at least, being available. These other issues, I have a number of notes from, I'm sure if it's Barry or who exactly wrote these, but, I'll look at them as well, and I'll come back with a revised draft, and we can kick around these issues some more. I mean, unless you have more input on this, I'll be happy to listen to anything I have to say, but I don't know how else to approach this other than that.
And just to be clear, that wasn't necessarily me making a proposal. It was me, like, problem solving, kind of like thinking, like just working through the logic. So, but I mean, if that makes sense, but that course of action makes sense to me.
I mean, I think it's clear that they're here and they serve actually a purpose. They're, we have a robust tourism industry happening, growing, and we are a destination. So, and there are no real hotels in a good, 12, 15 mile distance. So it is a benefit to the community. It's also a benefit to some of our residents in terms of income. So it does have a lot of positives. I think we recognize that. It's just a matter of making sure that everyone is safe and protected. And I agree in terms of the middle housing that we're looking for. That is in some ways, a zoning question and issue that, we are going to be dealing with, I think, in the years to come. So I don't think the short-term rentals will take it all away, but I think we have to be clear about a direction towards, making or finding ways to get apartments that are good for our community, so.
Do we want to open it up for
Yeah,
public comment?
so, with that, any other comments from the
Well,
board? Yeah.
Yeah, one comment I'd make is that, and Steve, I hear you about the idea of potentially reworking it. I'm partial to the draft we have now.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the law's not set in stone, the winds may be shifting, I get all that. Also following the lead of a number of other municipalities before us in New York State specifically, who have thought through these things, I think that lean towards the owner occupancy is, in my opinion, it prioritizes safety, and tries to minimize the nuisance factor. And so my thought is, with the draft we have, I think it's a pretty good draft we can keep working off of. That's where I stand.
My thought, excuse me one second, but my thought too, in terms of that, is if it goes before the circuit court, and the circuit court sees an overwhelming amount of communities that have this as their local law, then maybe they would think, well, there's a reason. There is, there's more to it than just interstate commerce. So,
That's a good point.
Steve, did you want to comment on that?
Look, my years before the courts have taught me that it is foolish to try to predict what a judge will say. You just never know how they're gonna come down on these things, so, I wouldn't discount what Michael's suggesting, that the fact that there are, a lot of municipalities that have these laws on the books might weigh with a federal court judge or panel, in New York. However, the Fifth Circuit was not persuaded by those types of arguments, and the fact that there were numerous laws on books that did require owner occupancy wouldn't change their analysis of the law. So, I won't say that there's no chance that what he's suggesting would weigh with the courts, but I don't think you can count on that if this ever, went ever went.
And the further away that court gets from us, the less likelihood they're going to make a decision that favors what the populace is doing.
You're either going to be in White Plains or you're going to be in New York City if you're brought into district court in New York on this kind of thing. I don't know if it would matter whether you had a district court judge in White Plains or one in New York City deciding it.
Yeah, but then it goes up from there, and the further up it goes, the less likelihood that argument's going to weigh favorably with the court. Is there a possibility that either of these decisions are going to get taken to the Supreme Court?
The 2022 decision, the time has long gone by. That's not going to happen. I don't know that the 2023 decision is on appeal. I'll check. I do not believe it is. It was in August, but I mean, is it possible? It's possible. I'll take a look at it. But even if it was, that's just one district court decision. The circuit court decision from the Fifth Circuit is still out there from 2022, and the reasoning of the court in that decision is what it is. And another court will read it over and either decide, yes, I agree with that reasoning, or no, I do not. And we'll see how they come down. But if I was litigating it, I sure would like to have that decision on my side rather than be going against it, saying that court was wrong.
And if we were to be the one whose law was challenged because we had this provision in it, what would the costs be for us? Are there potential for damages?
Barry, I don't want to discuss that in open session.
Okay.
We'll have a closed session. We can get into it, but I don't want to do that.
Gotcha. And Tom, relative to the comment that you made, right now I believe the way our draft law reads is the owner has to occupy the premises for 6 months. So the 6 months that they're renting it, nobody has to be there.
There's an agent.
Yes, there's an agent. Yes. Yeah, the requirement for an agent if the owner isn't there.
Right.
It only says that for the Main Street area, though.
No.
Am I just reading it wrong? Okay.
It says it for the Main Street area, but the owner occupancy requirement is the owner has to be there for 6 months.
Right.
Says the owner
And
or
if they're
agent
not-
shall reside.
If they're not, then they have to have an agent that resides within 15 miles.
I didn't read it that way. I don't think that's what it
Then
says.
then there's no requirement. Then there's no requirement at all.
For an agent.
For an
No,
agent.
beyond that 6-month period, that's how I'm reading it right now. But I'm,
It says in the case of property in the central business zone, the owner or agent shall reside within 15 miles of the property. Is that what you're referring to?
No, but what it says is, and you gotta go to the definition of owner occupied. It says that owner occupied means a residence in which the record owner maintains as his or her domicile. Now, a domicile is the place where you always intend to return to. It's your principal place of residence. You can have a house down in Florida you go to over the winter, but you're always coming back to New York, that's your domicile. And which he or she occupies as his or her residence, not less than 6 months in the calendar year, period. And then it goes on to say, in the case of property in the central business zone, the owner or agent shall reside within 15 miles of the property. So central business zone is a little different, but anywhere else, it's gotta be your domicile, and you gotta be there for at least 6 months.
But the 6 months you're not there, there's no control over the property and who you rent it to.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
that needs,
so we should at least have
You're right, that should be in
covered
there.
by a registered agent.
Yeah.
So that could be clarified in this, I agree. The other part that isn't mentioned, I think, is parking.
Right.
And there should be a limit on the number of cars, because as we've seen, if you follow what's going on, in the town, there's some where,
Yeah. On the street.
there will be 12 cars that show up in the driveway, but only 6 people are allowed to stay there.
And-
Go figure how that works.
And we're clear on the bedrooms and the occupancy based on square footage. So a calculation can be made as to how many people can reside there as part of the short-term rental. And I think we should look at adding a restriction whereby they can't have guests greater than a certain number, or, say it's the number of the people that are residing there as the short-term rental. So that we restrict those big parties unless, we put in a provision that would allow that to happen only with the permission of the planning board or the village board.
would it make sense for us to talk about, like, the other discussion items on this during discussion, or is that just gonna extend, cause I know we have to talk about Ray's also tonight.
Right. Well, we can, but I would like to give
Yeah,
Patrick the opportunity to read your letter to the board, please.
Patrick Gallagher. My first and to me the most telling question to the board is, have you researched how many of the B&Bs, or the more legal and pejorative term short-term rentals, are full-time legal residences owner-occupied by seniors aging in place with the income generated? Do you know? You know how many, you know much more about the Main Street rentals. What do you know about me and people like me before this is configured? I'm a 32-year resident. I lived here almost half my life. My income consists of Social Security and Airbnb. My home is a legal two-family, well-maintained, well-insured. Electrical inspections are current, no pun intended. Its location, size, and appearance are very much in harmony with the image the village works so hard to project to the rest of the world. The reality is that the existing use of my home does not require any additional services from the village. When my family visits, I have room to accommodate them. Is anyone on this board aging in place in similar circumstances? Because I think that there are more of us than you might think doing this. And I don't know if that's something that's being thought of. Does anyone on the board have one or more rental apartments? Are those long-term rentals targeted for additional taxes? Because if those are going to be imposed as a fee or whatever you want to call it, it's a tax. My guests pay Orange County occupancy tax. I've had approximately 350 guests since 2017 rather. I have a top rating. I have no problems requiring intervention, nor will I. I don't accommodate falling down drunks or inebriated drivers. My guests arrive with a lot of disposable income. They walk 2 short blocks into the village and they spend it freely. You're all familiar with the impact of a local multiplier effect and the positive impacts of money spent locally. it's unlikely a long-term renter who already can't afford to live here and for whom there are no available rentals would have the disposable income, my guess, to pour into the community. Residents like myself in an owner-occupied Airbnb are a benefit to the community, not a problem to be solved. There seems to be an unfortunate bias and narrative that all short-term rentals are used as party houses and that all short-term rentals need to be put in harness, charged a tax, and restrained. We have a few Bourbon Streets, but we're not New Orleans. We don't have South by Southwest here. The Village is a corporation. People running multiple B&B operations that are not owner-occupied are likely incorporated. Businesses on Main Street are corporations, and you need to differentiate corporate interests from residents' basic needs. This is not a criticism because I support the fact that the Village finds funds to purchase and refurbish property for the nonprofit Chamber of Commerce. At the same time, village trees outside the business district uproot and destroy my sidewalks for which I'm responsible. Again, you know, I've got enough expenses. I pay a lot to maintain my house. I do a lot of the maintenance myself. I don't call on the village for that. I'm called on the village to correct, I'm called on to correct some of the things that I encounter as a result of village trees and other situations. West Street is an unrestrained raceway. I just had to throw that in, nothing unrelated. I repair my sidewalks, I paint and maintain my own house, I already pay plenty of tax. I'm gonna skip a little part here, and rather than adding a new tax to further burden long-term senior residents on Social Security, aging in place by taking in boarders, maybe explore a 1% village alcohol tax. You would have more money than you'd know what to do with. I'm fiscally responsible and need to live within my means. They are stretched to the limit. I don't have the additional budget to contribute to the corporation of the Village of Warwick, New York. And Barry, lastly, I want to ask you, where's Grover Norquist when you need him?
Who?
Look him up, you'll know.
I will.
Thank
The
you.
guy that wants to drown Village in the bathtub, Barry. Not Village, government, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Can we have a copy of that for the
Yeah.
record? Thank
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, and this is not I just want to say that we don't see Airbnbs as negatives, as I mentioned before.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a balance, and that's what we're looking for.
And I
And
understand that, and I appreciate that. I don't want the Village in my house. I'm, you know, Bill wrote this. I have a lot of respect for him. He showed up in my backyard 4 or 5 years ago when no one else did. I think that he's acting in good faith. I think you're all acting in good faith, and I appreciate the fact that you guys work so hard for, you know, and have to listen to me for all the time you put in. I really do appreciate that.
and we
Right.
appreciate that comment.
Yeah, and it's the truth.
It's good.
I just hope that you know that there's a lot of people like us, and really, you have no place in my home. I've got plenty of insurance. I totally maintain it. Thanks.
Thank you. I think what we'll do is take a 5-minute break. So, yes.
Motion to close the public
Motion,
hearing?
yes.
Or not the public hearing,
But not
excuse me, the
public-
work session.
Okay. Do I have a
So
second?
moved? Oh, second?
All in favor?
Aye.
So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be right back for our regular board meeting. So,
You're gonna say regularly scheduled
regularly
programming?
scheduled programming.
Regular scheduled programming.
Let's get this.